Most people think of the Vatican as a museum in the open air, marble, frescoes, saints, tourists, and the Great Dome of St. Peter's rising above one of the most photographed squares on Earth. But beneath that familiar surface lies something very different. Under the marble floors, under the papal tombs, under the main altar itself, there is another world, one that remained sealed for centuries. Beneath the smallest state in the world lies a buried Roman city of the dead, hidden in darkness for nearly 1,500 years. Every year, millions of visitors cross St. Peter's Square, gaze up at Michelangelo's dome, and take photographs beside Bernini's colonnade. Almost none of them realize that just a few meters below their feet runs an ancient Roman street nearly 2,000 years old. Along that street stand buildings with doors, painted walls, mosaic floors, inscriptions, and names belonging to people long turned to dust. Faces, painted in antiquity, still look out from ceilings into the underground dark. The Vatican was built over a cemetery, and in a sense, it always knew it. 2,000 years ago, the land that is now Vatican City stood outside the walls of Rome. It was known as the Ager Vaticanus, the Vatican Field. The land was damp, clay-heavy, and affected by high groundwater and marshy conditions. It was poor farmland, but ideal for burial. Roman law generally forbade burying the dead within the city walls, so cemeteries developed along the roads leading out of Rome. The Vatican Hill became one of those burial zones, but not as a simple graveyard of scattered tombs. Over time, it became something much larger, a built necropolis, almost a city of the dead. Wealthy Roman families constructed elaborate mausoleums there, small funerary houses with decorated interiors, painted walls, mosaics, carved sarcophagi, and even windows. They stood closely together along the road like urban buildings, 22 structures shoulder to shoulder, pagans and early Christians side by side in death, in ways they rarely stood side by side in life. This was not an empty burial field, it was a district. Each mausoleum had a door, and family members entered to leave offerings of food and wine because Romans believed the dead still required care. According to Christian tradition, it was here that the Apostle Peter was buried. He was executed under Nero around 67 AD, reportedly crucified upside down at his own request because he considered himself unworthy to die in the same manner as Christ. His body, tradition says, was taken down and buried in the nearest cemetery on the Vatican Hill. Nearby stood the Circus of Nero, a racetrack and spectacle ground capable of holding around 20,000 spectators. It was there, according to early accounts, that Nero staged brutal executions of Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The obelisk that now stands in the center of St. Peter's Square, the massive red granite monolith brought from Egypt long before the Christian era, once stood inside Nero's circus. It was already there when Christians were tortured and killed. It was there, according to tradition, when Peter died. It is perhaps the only object still standing above ground that could have physically witnessed those events. Centuries later, when Emperor Constantine decided to build the first basilica over Peter's grave, he faced a severe engineering problem. The land was uneven. The necropolis beneath it was full of mausoleums, passageways, and changing levels. Rather than clear it away completely, Constantine chose a more radical solution. The upper part of the hill was cut back, and the spaces between and above the mausoleums were filled with earth and rubble. The tombs were not destroyed so much as buried alive. An entire funerary district was entombed beneath the new Christian basilica. The city of the dead became the foundation of the living church. Once sealed, it remained hidden for roughly 16 centuries. Imagine that buried district before it disappeared. A Roman woman walks down the paved street carrying bread and oil. She opens the door of a mausoleum. On the wall, in flickering light, are the painted faces of her dead parents. She leaves food beside an urn, lights a lamp, speaks their names aloud, and returns to daily life. For her, it is an ordinary morning. She does not know that within a century the place will be filled in and forgotten. She does not know that no living person will stand there again for more than 1,000 years. Then, in 1939, history broke open. Pope Pius XI died, and before his death, he asked to be buried in the grottos beneath St. Peter's Basilica. When workers began preparing the burial space, their tools struck an old brick wall. Behind it was a chamber. Beyond that chamber was a corridor. Beyond that, more rooms. By accident, they had opened the upper edge of the buried necropolis beneath the basilica. The new Pope, Pius XII, immediately ordered secret excavations. The work was to remain hidden from the press, the public, and even many Vatican officials. The stakes were enormous. If the excavation uncovered the grave of St. Peter, it would be one of the greatest religious discoveries in Christian history. If it uncovered evidence that contradicted long-held tradition, it could create an equally enormous crisis. The excavations lasted from 1940 to 1950. They were conducted in narrow, airless, underground corridors lit by kerosene lamps, in conditions where every step carried the risk of collapse. Soil was removed at night. Trusted workers were chosen for silence as much as for skill. And all of this happened during the Second World War while Europe was tearing itself apart above ground. At one point, according to accounts tied to the excavation, German officers in civilian clothes came to the Vatican asking questions about suspicious sounds beneath the basilica. Pius XII reportedly received them personally, showed them only the visible grottos, and dismissed the noises as simple restoration work. It was a deliberate deception. The true excavations were taking place deeper below, hidden beneath the visible level. Workers were warned that if anyone approached from above, lamps were to be extinguished immediately and silence maintained until the visitors left. What they uncovered over those 10 years would change the understanding of the Vatican forever. What emerged from those hidden excavations exceeded even the most ambitious expectations. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica lay an entire funerary street lined with 22 mausoleums, each different from the next, each preserving a fragment of Roman life and death in astonishing detail. Some interiors were decorated with vines and birds, symbols of the afterlife and renewal. Others contained mosaic floors with dolphins, tritons, and sea creatures. In another, the ceiling still bore images of Mercury, the guide of souls to the underworld. The sealed darkness had preserved these colors with extraordinary force. When archaeologists first pierced a wall and shone their lamps inside, they were not seeing faded traces. They were seeing faces painted nearly 2,000 years earlier, still vivid in the half-light. Participants in the excavations later described these moments not simply as discoveries, but as encounters. A woman with the hairstyle of a Roman matron, a man in a toga identified by inscription, a child represented in paint beside objects that had once belonged to her. The rooms were not abstract archaeological deposits. They were intimate spaces, preserved almost like interrupted visits. One of the most emotionally striking finds came from a child's sarcophagus. Inside were the remains of a girl, perhaps 10 or 12 years old. On the lid was an inscription mourning a beloved daughter whose life had been too short. Beside her lay a small clay doll with movable limbs. For nearly 2 millennia, it had remained in the sealed darkness beside its owner. When one archaeologist lifted it, the arms reportedly still moved at their joints. Among all the frescoes, inscriptions, and architectural discoveries, this simple toy became one of the excavation's most haunting human moments. The necropolis also revealed one of the earliest known images of Christ in world art, and it was nothing like the image later Christianity made familiar. In one mausoleum, archaeologists found a mosaic or painted representation of Christ as a youthful charioteer of the sun, resembling Helios or Apollo far more than the bearded Christ of medieval iconography. He appears radiant, almost solar, driving through the heavens. Dated to the 2nd century, the image forces a difficult but fascinating question. How did the earliest Christians imagine Christ in relation to the pagan world around them? The answer suggested by this image is not separation, but reinterpretation. Early Christianity did not emerge in a visual vacuum. It borrowed, transformed, and repurposed symbolic language already familiar across the Roman world. Christ as a solar figure was later pushed aside as Christian art moved toward more distinct and doctrinally separate forms. But in the buried darkness under the Vatican, that older visual language remained sealed and preserved. Nearby, archaeologists identified the Mausoleum of the Julii, one of the clearest early Christian tombs in the necropolis. It contained recognizable Christian imagery such as Jonah and the whale, and the Good Shepherd carrying a lamb. Yet, just across a wall less than a meter thick, stood pagan mausoleums decorated with figures such as Mercury, Apollo, and Dionysus. That proximity tells its own story. The real Rome was not divided into clean blocks of belief. Christians and pagans buried their dead almost wall to wall, sharing space, architecture, and funerary habits, even while holding sharply different convictions. But the central purpose of the Vatican excavation was always the same: to determine whether the burial place of the Apostle Peter could truly be found. As archaeologists followed the necropolis street and documented the mausoleums, they noticed something significant. Many of the structures seemed oriented around a particular point directly beneath the main altar of the basilica. At that location, they found a rough masonry feature, not a grand tomb, but the remains of a modest memorial structure corresponding to what second-century sources had called the Trophy of Gaius, a monument said to mark Peter's grave. Beneath it lay a simple brick-lined grave cut into the earth. The grave, however, was empty. After years of excavation, the apparent result was devastating, a void where the apostle's body was supposed to be. According to later accounts, Pope Pius XII was deeply shaken by the preliminary conclusion. Yet the story did not end there. One of the scholars connected to the work, the Italian epigrapher Margherita Guarducci, began paying attention to details others had passed by. Near the so-called Trophy of Gaius, she focused on a small side niche concealed behind a marble panel. Inside were bones wrapped in cloth woven with gold thread. Analysis suggested that the bones belonged to an older man, roughly in the age range tradition would allow for Peter. More intriguingly, particles of earth associated with the bones matched the type of soil found in the empty grave beneath the memorial. Guarducci proposed that the body may originally have been buried in the grave below, then later removed and placed more carefully into the niche nearby for protection or veneration. There was also an inscription scratched into the wall near the niche in Greek letters. Guarducci interpreted it as reading, "In essence, Peter is here." Her argument was never absolute proof in the scientific sense. There was no name carved directly on the bones, no DNA comparison possible, and no final test that could end the debate forever. But the convergence of location, tradition, age, soil evidence, and inscription was powerful enough that in 1968, Pope Paul VI publicly announced that the remains of the Apostle Peter had been found. Even then, the statement was cautious. The evidence was presented as compelling, not mathematically conclusive. For believers, it was enough. For skeptics, it remains an important but unprovable hypothesis. That tension has never fully disappeared. Yet whether one accepts the identification or not, the excavation transformed the question from legend into archaeology. Above this buried necropolis lies another layer, the Vatican grottos, a system of chapels and burial spaces where many popes have been interred from the medieval period into modern times. These grottos are accessible to visitors and already feel ancient, but compared to what lies beneath them, they are almost recent additions. Deeper still, and beyond the Vatican proper, lies the larger underground world of Rome itself. Catacombs, funerary tunnels, and layered burial systems extending for enormous distances through a soft volcanic tuff. This is where the Vatican's underground story widens beyond Peter and beyond the Basilica. Because once one begins descending beneath Rome, the city no longer looks like a single historical surface. It begins to reveal itself as stacked time, one civilization built over another, each layer covering but never entirely erasing what came before. If the necropolis beneath St. Peter's reveals one hidden Vatican, the catacombs and archives reveal two more. Together they show that the Vatican is not simply a center of visible power built above ground. It is also a vertical world of burial, concealment, memory, and documents layered beneath centuries of stone. Beneath Rome stretches an enormous network of catacombs carved into soft volcanic tuff. In some places, these underground cemeteries descend through multiple levels, reaching depths of around 25 meters. Their corridors run for vast distances, and the walls are lined with niches from floor to ceiling. By some estimates, these systems once held the remains of hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is a literal city of the dead, extended through darkness in stacked layers. Walking through the catacombs is unlike walking through an ordinary ruin. The passages are narrow, the ceilings low, the tough walls close on both sides. Many burial niches are now empty, their contents long decayed or removed, but some still bear the stone closures or inscriptions that once sealed them. Names survive, dates survive, simple invocations survive. Some inscriptions include symbols of the fish rather than the cross, because for early Christians the fish served as a coded sign of identity. The Greek word ichthys became an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. In these tunnels, religion, danger, burial, and secrecy once merged into one environment. The walls also preserved the voices of visitors from long ago. Some left rough prayers scratched by hand into stone. Others wrote appeals for the dead, or words of grief, or requests for intercession. These traces are moving precisely because they are so ordinary. They do not speak in theological abstraction. They speak in the intimate language of people who came into the underground with oil lamps and memory. Someone asks Peter and Paul to pray for Victor. Someone asks God to remember a servant named Felix. Someone addresses a mother now gone. These are not formal monuments. They are fragments of private love made public only because the stone survived. During periods of persecution, catacombs were not only places of burial. Early Christian communities are believed to have gathered in them, especially in larger chambers where prayers, commemorations, and liturgical acts could take place in relative secrecy. People came below ground not because they feared the dead, but because the living above them could be more dangerous. In these hidden spaces, communities prayed, argued, remembered, and organized while imperial authority moved through the streets overhead. Later, once Christianity had been legalized, many of these same burial places became sites of pilgrimage. The dead remained in place, but their function in the living religious world changed. This continuity matters because it shows how much of early Christian life was literally underground. Beneath the Vatican and beneath Rome, one finds not just tombs, but the physical record of a faith developing in hidden rooms, through burial customs, symbols, and acts of remembrance. The surface city projected imperial power. The underground kept another history, and yet even the catacombs are not the Vatican's final mystery. Beyond tombs, frescoes, and buried streets lies the last underground kingdom, the archive. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is one of the most famous and least fully accessible document collections in the world. Its shelves stretch for roughly 85 kilometers, a distance often used to dramatize the scale of the holdings. Stored there are documents spanning from the early medieval centuries to modern times. Papal correspondence, legal records, diplomatic reports, trial transcripts, private letters, administrative decrees, and files tied to some of the most consequential events in European history. For generations, the archive's former title, the Secret Archive, encouraged endless speculation, though the word secret, in the older sense, meant more private or personal than conspiratorial. Even so, the aura of secrecy never disappeared because access has always remained tightly controlled. Within those shelves lie records connected to Galileo's trial, the English Reformation, papal dealings with kings and emperors, appeals from condemned prisoners, and letters from figures who now occupy textbook history. The significance of these papers is not just in their age, but in the fact that they preserve decisions before those decisions hardened into simplified public history. Archives record hesitation, contradiction, bargaining, and fear. They preserve the human drafts behind official memory. One of the most famous examples is the so-called Chinon parchment, rediscovered in the early 21st century. This document recorded the papal investigation into the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. For centuries, the Templars were remembered largely through the story of their condemnation and destruction under charges of heresy. But the Chinon document showed that Pope Clement V had in fact granted them absolution in the course of the investigation before later political pressure, especially from the French crown, helped drive the order toward ruin. That does not erase the historical tragedy of what followed, but it radically complicates it. A single document hidden for centuries in an archive changed the moral shape of an entire episode of medieval history. That is the power of a buried record. It can leave accepted history standing unchanged on the surface while altering everything underneath. The same archive preserves letters connected to monarchs, reformers, artists, and political transformations that reshaped Europe. Henry VIII's appeal regarding his marriage, documents tied to Martin Luther, letters from imprisoned queens, correspondence involving Michelangelo, records of tribunals, and diplomatic files from later centuries all sit within a system where access is selective and tightly supervised. A researcher who gains entry does not wander freely through history. They request specific files, justify their project, and receive only what has been approved. Vast amounts of material remain physically close, yet practically unreachable. This restriction is part of what keeps the Vatican's underground story so compelling. It is not only that the Vatican possesses burials, catacombs, and ancient ruins beneath its surface. It is that each lower layer offers a different kind of hidden truth. The necropolis holds a buried Roman district and perhaps the memory of Peter. The catacombs preserve the secret life of early Christian communities. The archive preserves written evidence that can reverse or complicate centuries of accepted narrative. In every case, what lies below unsettles what stands above. That pattern may be the Vatican's most enduring symbolism. Above ground, the place projects order, ritual, visibility, and certainty. Pilgrims, processions, marble, liturgy, official pronouncements, and architecture all work together to create an image of continuity and clarity. Below ground, the atmosphere changes. There are sealed chambers, missing bones, disputed identifications, forgotten dolls, hybrid images of Christ, scratched prayers, anonymous dead, and documents that reveal how unstable human institutions can be. The underground Vatican is not less holy, but it is more complicated, more human, and more difficult to control. In that sense, the Vatican is not a single place. It is a stack of worlds. The basilica stands above the grottos stand above the necropolis. The necropolis stands above older Roman ground. Nearby catacombs carry another subterranean history outward through the city. Beneath all of them, archives preserve an intellectual underground as dense and consequential as any burial system. One level keeps bodies, another keeps memory, another keeps paper. Together, they create a vertical monument not only to faith, but to concealment and survival. That is why the Vatican feels different once one imagines what lies below it. St. Peter's Square is no longer just an open plaza framed by Bernini's arms of stone. The obelisk in its center is no longer only an Egyptian monument repurposed by Christian Rome. The basilica itself is no longer merely the final triumphant church. Each visible element rests on buried layers filled with unresolved questions. Was Peter truly moved from his first grave into the niche nearby? What else remains sealed in untouched mausoleums? Which paintings still wait in darkness? Which records in the archive could overturn other accepted narratives if opened and read? These questions are part of what gives the Vatican its unique gravity. It is not mysterious merely because people like mystery. It is mysterious because the physical and documentary evidence beneath it genuinely resists complete visibility. Even after excavations, restorations, scholarship, and centuries of interpretation, the site remains unfinished as a field of knowledge. And perhaps that is the final truth beneath the Vatican. The deeper one goes, the less it resembles a monument that has already been fully explained. Instead, it becomes a place where every answer sits above another question. A church above a necropolis above older Rome, an archive above unwritten possibilities, marble above darkness, certainty above layers of doubt. For a state so small on the map, the Vatican extends downward with astonishing depth. And the deeper it goes, the more it reveals that history is never a flat surface. It is a buried city, a sealed niche, a corridor of names, a forgotten toy, a hidden parchment, and a door that opens not onto closure, but onto another layer waiting below.